Welcome friends, in this video I'm swapping the pads and rotors on my wife's 2020 X3 plug-in hybrid, flushing the brake fluid and spending way too long cleaning up the calipers. First step was opening the hood, then turning off the parking brake and getting the vehicle in the air. I used my new QuickJack 7000 TLX. Next, I pulled the wheels and tires off using a 17mm socket and the new generation M12 Impact that I finally got in the mail. I pulled all four wheels off and placed them under the vehicle for some additional insurance. Under the hood on the driver's side, I unlocked this small cowl and pulled it out to reveal the brake fluid reservoir. I should have immediately cleaned the cap, but I just loosened it and then set it back down. I ran through replacing the rotor and pad on the passenger front and then used that knowledge to do the driver's side. This is what I did. I started by pulling out the old brake wear sensor from the interior pad and unclipped it all the way back to the connection before disconnecting and then immediately replacing it all the way down to the brake line. Next, I used a 17mm wrench and 13mm socket to loosen and remove the guide pin bolts. Then I used a flathead screwdriver to slightly compress the piston and remove the caliper, zip tying it out of the way. Then I pulled off the old pads before using an E16 socket to remove the caliper bracket. These bolts are torqued down tight, and it is a little difficult to get a long breaker bar into the wheel well. After pulling off the bracket, I used a 6mm Allen key to remove the rotor bolt and pulled the rotor off. I wire wheeled down the hub surface, making sure to wear eye protection and a respirator. And I also applied some anti-seize on the surface, making sure not to get any inside of the hub threads. Next, I wire wheeled off the brake dust from the caliper. The coating on these is pretty thick, but I probably should have used a nylon wire wheel instead to protect the coating. I used a ratcheting piston compressor to push the piston back in, but the rear of the caliper is flat, so the old brake pad and C-clamp method is totally viable. I used brake cleaner to clean off both sides of the rotor and make sure that there was no packaging oil on the surfaces. Then I could install the new rotor onto the hub and torque the bolt to 16 Newton meters. Two notes here. I had to verify the direction of the slotting and vanes on the rotor by part number, since these particular ones did not have arrows and they weren't labeled, at least in my case. The slots on these run to the rear. Also, the rotor bolt is supposed to be one-time use, but I reused my old one. Then I threw some anti-seize on the rotor's mating surface before turning to the brackets. I wire wheeled the bracket and pulled the pins out for cleaning. I spent quite a bit of time cleaning the pins, the rubber boot baffles, and the bracket pinholes to get out all of the old grease. I didn't have any corrosion on the pins or on the inside of the bracket, but I still ran a brass brush on the inside of the bracket and wire wheeled the pin heads. Once everything was clean, I put some high-temp silicone brake grease on the bracket pinholes and on the pins. I also lubed up the pad mounting points in advance, so I wouldn't risk getting any grease on the rotor once installed. Then I put everything back together, making sure that the notched pin is on the leading edge of the caliper, and that the bushing pin is on the trail edge. Then I threw the brackets back on the spindle and torqued it down to 130 Newton meters. Again, these bolts are supposed to be one-time use, but I reused mine. Since these brake pads do not have an adhesive film, I lubed up the back before installing them into the bracket. The pin bolts are also one-time use, and they had blue thread lock on from the factory, but I reused them, wire wheeled off the old thread lock, and reapplied some more before reinstalling the caliper and torquing the bolts down to 35 Newton meters. The The last thing for this caliper was installing the new sensor into the interior brake pad. It was a snug fit, but I was able to get it on there by hand. On the rear axle, I completed the driver's side before moving to the rear passenger and getting to work. The first thing I did was pull out the brake wear sensor. This one was stuck in there and I ended up breaking it while trying to pull it out. This time I loosened the caliper before pulling out the old wear sensor and installing the new one. Then I used the same 17mm wrench and 13mm socket to remove the caliper guide pin bolts before resting the caliper on the upper control arm. Then I used the E16 to loosen the mounting bracket bolts, and I actually found that the 13mm Craftsman spline socket fit over those E16 bolts, but I wouldn't count on it for breakaway or for torquing it. With the bracket removed, I could use my 6mm Allen key to remove the rotor and start the cleanup process on the hub and caliper. This whole rear axle area was filthy, so I brushed off the dust and dirt from the EMF, or the electromechanical parking actuator. Then I disconnected the wiring to the EMF and removed the two EMF bolts using a 5mm Allen key. Once I got the wiring bracket out, I cleaned the surface again before finally pulling off the EMF. I used a standard ratchet with a T45 Torx bit in a clockwise direction to slowly and completely loosen the tension on the piston. This should not be kept all the way loose, so I backed it off counterclockwise an eighth of a turn. Now I could compress the brake caliper piston. If I were using a C-clamp on the rear, then I would want to reinstall the EMF first to provide a safe, flat surface on the back of the caliper. On the bracket, I popped off the old brake pad guides, pulled out the guide pins, and cleaned up the bracket surface. Now that the dust had settled, I threw anti-seize on the hub before prepping the rotor and installing it using the same old bolt, even though I should have replaced it according to BMW. On the bracket, I cleaned out the guide pinholes, cleaned off the guide pins, and got all of the old grease out of the dust boot baffles. Then I lubed everything back up and reinstalled the guide pins. It is important to note that the rear guide pins are both the same notched type, so no worries about mixing them up. Now I could install and lubricate the new brake pad guides, and this time I actually lubed up the brake pads and installed them in first so that I wouldn't have to fight it on the vehicle. I was able to slide the bracket and pads onto the rotor and hand tighten the bracket bolts before torquing them to 130 Newton meters. I did a quick lube up of the caliper surfaces and slid it over the pads, connecting it to the bracket with the same bolts and some blue thread lock, torquing them to 35 Newton meters. The EMF is supposed to auto-adjust over time, but for my peace of mind, I rotated the spindle counterclockwise until it clamped the rotor, and then I backed it off an eighth of a turn. Then I lubed up the caliper spindle O-ring with fresh brake fluid before reinstalling the EMF and hose bracket, torquing the single-use bolts to 12 Newton meters. Now I could finish up running the new brake pad wear sensor, and for this one I did need some help getting it all the way in. Under the hood, I tried to suck out as much old brake fluid as I could, but these new reservoirs don't let you get that much out. Then I topped it off with fresh fluid before prepping the motive pressure bleeder. You're supposed to use 2 liters of brake fluid, which I did buy, but I only ended up putting 1 liter of the 8.4 SL6 brake fluid inside of there. Then I put on the cap adapter, pumped it up, and got to bleeding, starting with the furthest away caliper from the reservoir. I used an 11mm flare nut wrench to loosen the bleeder screw and kept bleeding the fluid until it came out clear. After bleeding all 4 calipers, I relieved the pressure on the bleeder, tightened it back, removed the cap adapter, being careful not to spill any brake fluid, and then I threw the cap back on just to keep the dust out while I grabbed the suction device again to pull out any extra fluid that was left in the reservoir. Then I could reinstall all of the wheels and tires, torque the lug bolts to 140 Newton meters, and place the vehicle back on the ground. Back in the car, I closed the door, made sure that I had the key with me. Without pressing on the brake, I hit the start button 3 times in quick succession and waited for the diagnostic mode notification to pop up. Since I have the digital dash, I held the BC button until the service menu came up. Mine went straight to brake fluid, so I held the BC button down again until the reset option came up, and then held it down again until it started the reset. Then you just have to turn the car off and hop out. So, for final thoughts, I want to point out that BMW does say in their repair manual that you have to replace the pin bolts, the bracket bolts, and the rotor bolt once removed. I assume that they are stretch torqued and will weaken over time. The manual also says not to use impact guns while tightening the lug bolts. To be safe, I always thread them in by hand and then tighten them slowly in a cross pattern before going through them all again at speed and then finally torquing them to spec. The brake fluid should be flushed every 2 years to retain full compression resistance, and the rotors and pads can last up to 50,000 miles usually. This vehicle is out of the maintenance warranty at 5 years and 51,000 miles. I changed the pads previously at 25,000 miles, and these rotors definitely need to be replaced at 50,000 miles. It is very frustrating that you need to keep buying updated scanners to unlock the special service functions on these cars, but I'm glad that you can get around it for the electromechanical brake on this vehicle. You can risk it and download the BMW software on your laptop, but the last time I did that, it was a virus and it wrecked my tablet, so I had to wipe it and then buy a whole new Windows license. I may save up to buy a subscription scanner in the future. Last note is on bedding the pads. I did do it on this vehicle, even though BMW says not to, mainly because I always have, and also because these are aftermarket rotors and pads. These are single-piece cast rotors compared to the 2-piece riveted OEM rotors. This R1 Concepts kit included Optimum OE pads, which I wanted since I haven't had good luck with ceramic pads that take forever to heat up. The kit also came with new sensors, rear side clips, and for some reason only the front slide pin bolts, not the rear ones. Oh, and the kit was drilled and slotted because race car. Anywho, that's all I got, and I'll see you next time.